Hi everybody, thank you for joining me here today. I'm Tengiz from Archipeg, which is a cloud-based digital enterprise architecture software. Today I want to talk about domain-driven design, or DDD in short, and its meta model, support for which we recently added to Archipeg. Let me first open the DDD meta model documentation page, which is under the Learning Center. And on the left side, you will find the section Archipeg's meta models. And currently, the last one in the list is the domain-driven design meta model. Let me open it. And in the first paragraph, traditionally, we provide links to the original sources of the knowledge. If you're curious what DDD is and you want to do a little bit more deep dive than this video will do, you can read a book or a reference publication. In short, and as also outlined by this synopsis, domain-driven design is an approach to software development and software architecture to tackle complexity in those areas of work by focusing your and your team's attention around the domain modeling. If you scroll down a little bit, you will also find the DDD meta model diagram, which is formatted similar to other meta model diagrams that perhaps you've seen from other tutorial videos. And on this diagram, traditionally we will have each distinct element highlighted only once, and then it may repeat several times on this diagram as a non-highlighted element. What it means is that it plays a primary role in one area when it's first introduced to you, and afterwards it may play a supporting role in other areas of this meta model. When it plays a supporting role, it will not be highlighted. When it's first introduced or plays the primary role, it will be highlighted in that section. We have split the meta model diagram for clarity of the provided information into various sections that correspond to major areas in this approach originally, and hence you will find on this diagram the section which talks about the bounded context, then two sections which talk about the model-driven design, and finally last two sections will talk about the context mapping and core domain distillation. I will keep this diagram open on my screen while switching back and forth between the Archipeg Architecture Cloud or the web application and this diagram, so that we will connect the concepts as you see here on this picture with the objects and associations that I have created for this demonstration purpose within the web application. Let me first locate my demo project in Archipeg Architecture Cloud. First, we will go to the projects, and then let me open this DDD example project, which has 27 objects, as you see, which I think will be sufficient to explain this topic to you. Let me prepare the diagram for the demonstration. And now let's go back to the diagram picture and start diving into each area of work. First, let's talk about bounded contexts, and in this area we will have three primary concepts, which will be bounded context itself, teams which are perhaps responsible to maintain or implement those bounded contexts, and then finally applications which correspond or implement those bounded contexts. Before showing you the sample objects, I want to show you one little trick. You can at any time turn on the help hints, and you will see next to each object its explanation or a hint. For instance, next to the bounded context, if I click on this little icon here, it will explain what bounded context is, and this explanation will correspond to its original sources, so you don't really need to go back and forth between a lot of documentation and this toolset, because the help or the hints are right at your fingertips. Let me turn off the help for now, and let's jump into the demonstration of the bounded contexts. Here I have created several bounded contexts, which are of course fictional. First, I need to explain that what we are looking at is a sample data set, and I was just trying to imagine how I would design, using domain-driven design, the Amazon's software architecture landscape. So I imagined that they would have, for instance, the product catalog bounded context and cart bounded context, which would correspond to those areas which you see when you go to the Amazon.com. The product catalog is the area which shows the search results and other products on the home page, and the cart is where you see your items and you can check out from there. Let me show you what I have inside the product catalog bounded context. It seems it has an associated application implementing it, and it's called Catapult. Again, this is an imaginary name, and this is perhaps not the real application name within Amazon. And then it has other associations, but the one I'm looking for is perhaps a team, and indeed there is an owner team. There is only one team whose name is the Mona Dev team, and now we have those three associations. Let me drop them on the diagram surface and we will see this all visually. And here it is. Here is our simplest diagram of the bounded context. Here we can see the team who owns the bounded context, as well as the application that implements this bounded context. And to further express similar intents, I could have dropped here several bounded contexts and their corresponding teams and applications. And perhaps that would give a good insight into the entire landscape that would consist of multiple bounded contexts. Let's go to the next section, which is a model-driven design consisting of the layers and modules. Again, those two primary concepts are almost orthogonal to each other. In other words, within the bounded context, you can group things using layer or module, or perhaps both. And so the layer is typically a horizontal slice, and the upper slices depend on the lower slices, while module is not exactly a horizontal slice. It's primarily perhaps a vertical slice, and various slices will depend on each other in various ways. And the other supporting concept in this case, which is entity, value object, domain event, and etc., will perhaps belong to one or another or both of them to express various relationships between those concepts. Let me demonstrate a few of those objects on the screen for clarity. So here I already have a product catalog bounded context. Let me remove all those redundant other objects and let's see what we have related to that section. Here we can see that this bounded context, the product catalog, consists of two layers, the application layer and business layer. And it also consists of two modules, one of them being recommendations and the other being search. Let me place them on the screen for now. And here I think it must be indeed clear that the correlation between the layers and the modules is not exactly one-to-one, and they are almost orthogonal to each other because we have those layers, they depend on each other. We also have modules which do depend on each other. Now let me try to drop a couple of entities or aggregates on the screen to see where into which module or into which layers they belong. First I will locate them again as before using the product details dialog, and then I will drop them on the diagram. And here the picture has become somewhat interesting now because I have dropped a product aggregate root, which turns out belongs to the product catalog business layer and also to the product catalog product module at the same time. And this aggregate root product nests value object called price. And this diagram right here on the screen is a good demonstration of how you would explain what kind of aggregate roots you have in your solution, where they belong, which modules they comprise, or which layers. And don't forget, of course, that you can at any time save your work as a diagram. I will not do this because I already have these diagrams created before the demonstration, but you can always do that and then come back to your work later on and either continue or present it to others. Let's go back to the diagram and see what else I wanted to demonstrate. So from this area of work, patterns and concepts, besides the aggregate root and the value object, I want to also demonstrate a domain event, which I know I have captured, and the repository. Let's see what I can do for this. On this picture, as you can see, I successfully expressed the relationships between the product and several other concepts. In this case, turns out the product dispatches a domain event called product price changed domain event, and then the two other concepts come into play because one of them, the product's repository, turns out stores this aggregate root product, and the other one, the update product price service, transforms the product aggregate. And I kept the price value object on the diagram as before. And this and other similar diagrams could be an effective approach to communicate how these kinds of various concepts relate to each other, such as which repositories are responsible to store which aggregate roots, or which services are transforming and modifying the aggregate roots, as well as what kind of domain events your domain experts care about, and which aggregates are dispatching those events. Let's see the next section, and that is context mapping. This is a quite interesting section because here we are talking about now a higher level landscape created by various bounded contexts, how they integrate, what kind of relationships they have between each other, and so on and so forth. So we are tapping more into the solution and enterprise architecture work streams. Let me see what I can do to demonstrate this area using my objects dataset. Here I have dropped quite a lot of bounded context and other related concepts on the screen, and this picture now, if I add some labels on the associations, would serve as a good context map diagram, which is one of the central concepts and ideas in the domain-driven design approach. So let me now show up their labels and let's continue our discussion from there. And here, now I think this context map starts to make more sense than before. So starting from the product catalog bounded context, it turns out it has a shared kernel together with the cart bounded context, which is called product schema. What that means is those two bounded contexts are perhaps contributing to this shared kernel, of course quite carefully, as you would do with other shared kernels typically. Also, the targeted experiments bounded context is a supplier because the product catalog is a customer in the customer-supplier relationship between those bounded contexts. And then we also have the conformist relationship between the product catalog and payments and cart and payments, in which product catalog and cart, both of them conform to the payments bounded context. And then one more relationship type, the anti-corruption layer. It seems the payments bounded context has built the anti-corruption layer for the Visa bounded context, which seems to be an outside concept from this entire Amazon.com landscape, and they have represented that outside or third-party application as a bounded context, which I think is a good idea. And finally, there is a payment XML, which is a published language which is understood by both Visa and the payments bounded contexts. And in this case, I would guess or assume that the payment XML is perhaps how Visa understands the transactions or interactions, and the payments bounded context is able to understand this published language. And on the bottom, we have one more interesting situation. Turns out we have a big ball of mud called legacy systems, which perhaps formed organically throughout many years of existence. And the two bounded contexts, the legacy Amazon.com and the legacy cart plus payments, belong to this big ball of mud. And while the big ball of mud generally is considered an anti-pattern, it is a well-known fact that many legacy or long-lasting projects sometimes develop it naturally, and this is the way to express that relationship between the big ball of mud and the bounded context, perhaps, which are for now considered as part of that big ball of mud. Quite an informative context map, don't you think? Now let's go back to the diagram and see what else we need to discuss. The last section we have left for discussion is the core domain distillation. And here is where we will start distilling various modules out of the bounded context, some of them being the core domain module, which is the most important part of any bounded context. And then the other pieces also could be distilled, such as generic subdomains or the abstract core. And also what is left sometimes is a cohesive mechanism, which is more of a generic usage framework, and that can also be distilled from a bounded context. Let me now try to show you the objects to demonstrate this relationship between various concepts that I now mentioned. And here I have found several concepts which are, I think, sufficient to explain this area of work. And so the product catalog bounded context turns out has a module which is called the product, and it plays a core domain module role within this bounded context. And the other module, the carousel imagery, turns out is a generic subdomain for the product catalog. And finally, it seems the engineers of the product catalog bounded context have extracted some generic usage framework, also known as cohesive mechanisms, for the cookie manipulation. It seems they called it cookie tools, which is a cohesive mechanism concept in this case. And within that, when we drill into it, we will find that it exposes an interface of an HTTP cookie parsing, and there can be other interfaces as well as in any other generic usage frameworks. And where this kind of diagram helps is to understand what is the most important part of any given bounded context, in this case this being a product module, and then what are the generic subdomains, or in other words, the problems that almost are part of this domain but still are more related towards some calculation where we want to devote less talent and less development forces, and that would be the carousel imagery. And finally, there are some cohesive mechanisms that belong together, such as the HTTP cookie parser and perhaps other interfaces as well. And we want to group them together and give this framework a name, which in this case is a cookie tools. And if we go back to the diagram, we will see that we have concluded discussing all the parts of this diagram, and I'm hoping that this gave you some clarity about both what the DDD is on some basic level, as well as how we have ported the domain-driven design as a meta model into Archipeg so that you can design your software solution and a little bit enterprise architecture initiatives using this meta model. And I highly encourage that you learn what domain-driven design is, because it will greatly help reduce the complexity in your software solution and enterprise architecture areas of work. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to us and we will help you both with answering your questions as well as adopting domain-driven design and other architecture initiatives or disciplines in your organization. And I hope you have a great day ahead of you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.